Part 25. Were we really talking about such things? I watched human movies and read their books. Things went much slower for them. You would think, with as long as we vampires lived, the dating part would go even slower, but it didn't. We called it dating, just to call it something. But once two vampires claimed feelings for each other, it was simply a step to be taken. Wolves mated for life, vampires union for life. Jonathan and I were together for life. That's how things worked in the only world I had ever known. It was part of my DNA, as twisted as that was right now. On my wolf and on my vampire side, he was my mate now. So, who's been taking care of things at Beamer's? And your other work things, I stated for a lack of a better word. Well, let's see. Derek is overseeing things at Beamer's. We talk daily, though. I have 3 other clubs, all run by very able vampires. Again, I talk to them daily. My seat at my dad's office is still there. I've been running it from a study your dad has loaned me. My investments pretty much take care of themselves, although I check on them daily too. I have them set to transfer the interest to other accounts. We vampires have our ways of living a long time without the human world realizing it, he winked. What about your mother? I asked carefully. He looked down for a brief moment. She died shortly after I was born, he stated. I knew his mother was full vampire, since he was, so it couldn't have been for the same reason as my mother. Vampires rarely died unless there was violence involved. She was on a shopping trip in a closed car, he stated. The car was hit by a semi-truck driven by humans. The injuries wouldn't have killed her, but the damage to the car let the sunlight in. It took them over half an hour to get her out of the car. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, reaching out and putting my hand on his. I didn't know her. I was too young, but my dad has never found anyone else. That also was very common among vampires and werewolves as well. There was another pause and he shook his head. So, what's the next question? What do you like to do for fun? Besides talk you out of secret closets? I swatted his arm playfully. Well, I've developed this one enjoyment. It involves a certain female. He leaned back over me and kissed me softly. I wrapped my arms around his neck and kissed him back. When I finally fell asleep, he stood and left the room. When I woke, he was sitting in the chair meant for Michael. I smiled at him and then looked over at Paige, who was still sleeping in her bed. I put a finger to my lips and then pointed. He nodded, and I slipped quietly out of the bed. I tiptoed into the bathroom, cleaned up, and changed. When I came back out, she was still asleep. I carefully put my clothes in the hamper and went back out to the main room. Jonathan was waiting for me. I looked around and noticed Track wasn't there. Michael waved from his control room, as I called it, and Martin bid me good morning. I looked at the clock. It was 5 a.m. No wonder Paige and Track were still asleep. My sleeping patterns were getting all twisted. This is when I was normally going to bed, not getting up. I made a silent vow to try to get back on a schedule. So, what happened at 2 a.m.? I asked as we walked towards the cupboard that held my thermos. He handed me one after checking the readout. We hadn't yet tested if my tolerance for temperature had changed. Nothing. Whoever it was must have realized we knew and they didn't show, he stated. I frowned. I told my dad we should keep it quiet and he should have let me go. I'm glad he didn't agree with you, he smiled and shut the cupboard. I finished my meal and he took it and gave it to the cook. then took my hand and led me to the couch. I sat and he turned to me. Were you serious about the party? He asked, his eyes sparkling. As much as I didn't want to, I nodded, smiling back. He reached over to the table and picked up a pen and paper. Good. I did some thinking while you were asleep. He looked at me. I did sleep too, for a while. Then he looked at the paper. I was trying to come up with a guest list. We can't have too many with the situation around here, but we need to invite the people that really matter, and then a few just on the basis that they are the gossip freaks and will spread the word. He chuckled, and I smiled. He was so excited about this. I didn't care that parties weren't on my favorite things to do list. I had told Track he wanted me to do it, and he said that the guys would come. Plus, the look on Jonathan's face as he explained the list of names he had come up with while I slept wiped away any misgivings I had, except for one. What if I started to shift during the party? I kept that to myself, though. I didn't want to worry him about that. I would find a way. I had already decided the next time I felt one coming, I would see if I could stop it. He turned the page. For your side, I have these names so far. Track and his family. I'll need all their actual names, though. He smiled at me and then looked back down at the paper. Rock, although I'm sure that isn't his real name either. I shook my head and he continued. Jackson, Miles, and his mate. Phil, Ryan, Allison, Joel. They're a couple now, so we have to invite them both. Did they have a party? He nodded and I frowned. They didn't invite us? You were a little busy, he smiled. It was when you were shifting every few hours. Allison wanted to postpone the party, but I told her you would be very upset with her if she did. Oh, thanks. I'm glad she didn't wait. He nodded. I have Paige down here too. Michael's a given. But are there others? I noticed how short my list was. Well, there's Marcus, the new werewolf. He's part of my clique. Jonathan wrote the name down and I tapped a finger on my chin. I guess that's it? He frowned at the paper and I smiled. It's okay. Like you said, I've been very sheltered. When he still didn't reply, I peered over the paper. There isn't some rule about having to have even amounts of people, is there? Not a rule, really, he stated, looking at his list that was 2 columns long already. But it seems very out of balance. I chuckled. Well, I know your vampire friends. Could you put them on my list? He shook his head. No, that doesn't count. I'll check with your dad. I'm sure he'll have a list. He was smiling again. So we need to pick a date, he stated, setting the paper down. Now this one I knew was very important. It would be the official date of us as a couple. You couldn't wait too long because certain romantic privileges weren't allowed until then, even though with Jonathan practically living here, those were pretty much shot anyhow. No, it didn't give us sexual rights, although many vampires didn't care about that anymore. I was a bit old-fashioned there. Making out was one thing, but until I was actually unioned, I looked up at Jonathan and wondered how he felt on this subject. Another question? He asked, smiling. I bit my lower lip. What are your beliefs on... Well, do you think vampires should wait until... Gads, how do you just throw this out into a conversation? He smiled at me. I'm very old-fashioned when it comes to certain things, Reina, he stated. While sitting on your bed while you sleep, or holding you after you shifted is one thing. I won't share your actual bed until we are union. I sighed in relief and he chuckled. Now that we have that out of the way, it seems we are on the same wavelength there. I nodded, and he did too. Good. Now for a date. I was thinking in 2 weeks from today. That should give Michael enough to check over the guest list and do whatever he needs to do. 2 weeks? That seemed very soon. With the manor in lockdown, Michael would be scrambling with security issues and the guest list on top of it. That would be September 1st. Easy enough to remember for anniversaries, I thought. I looked towards Michael's control room and Jonathan chuckled. He has a whole staff to help him. That might be true, but I knew Michael and he would want his hand in all the arrangements when it came to security. You know, it's usually the female that's all excited about this party and is fussing over guest lists, he chuckled. I shrugged. I just don't know that many people. He nodded. I also know that you're doing this more for me and your dad than anything else. He pulled me over and put his arm around me. And we both thank you. I promise not to make it too painful. I laughed and laced my fingers in with his. Then it came. The slight tingling in my calves. It really did have awful timing. I tightened my jaw, and this time I focused on it instead of trying not to think about it. My body shook a little, and Jonathan leaned back. He watched my face for a second and then sat back more, keeping his hand in mine. He knew what I was trying to do, without me having to say anything. That was good, since I couldn't have unclenched my jaws if I wanted to. "Stop!" I screamed in my mind. "This is my body. I'm in control." I tried to find the source of the thing that was trying to spread. I couldn't, so I focused on the tingling sensation itself. I mentally blocked it, like a tourniquet, and I tried to steady my heartbeat at the same time. Calm. I needed to be calm. I heard voices around me, but I ignored them. I had to rely on Jonathan to handle crowd control. I closed my eyes and held on, so to say, trying to keep as calm as possible, keep my heart rate steady, and force the sensation not to spread. I felt the sweat dripping down my face, and someone wiped it away. That touch was all it took, and I lost control. As I felt it slip, I quickly pulled my hand out of Jonathan's. "Don't hurt them. Keep talking. Don't hurt them. Keep talking." I repeated those phrases over and over as the pain ripped through me. I was able to step outside of the pain easily this time, like stepping through a mirror and sitting in a chair in a dark room. I could hear and smell everything around me, but I was detached at the same time. "Don't hurt them. Keep talking." Then it was over. I blinked and opened my eyes. Jonathan was smiling at me, and his clothes and skin were intact. I smiled, which meant my mouth opened and my tongue flopped out. My clothes were not so lucky. I saw them ripped and scattered on the floor. There had to be a better way. "Everyone okay?" I thought, with the part of my mind that pushed the thoughts out. He gave a quick nod, still smiling. I turned and looked around. I had even managed to stay on the couch. I saw a maid with a washcloth, and a small growl came out. I turned away quickly. She was just trying to help. The doctor approached me, his caddy in hand, and I sighed. Jonathan chuckled, but this time he watched what the man did, very closely. He asked him questions, and the doctor snapped his answer, not liking the distraction. I liked it when Jonathan was protective and took charge. I watched him, and he winked at me. Finally, the doctor took his caddy and scurried to his little makeshift lab. "So, when do we get the all clear to get out of here?" I asked. Jonathan turned and bent over, reaching past me for the pad of paper. "Hopefully soon, still waiting for your dad to come in," he whispered. When he sat back, I looked at him, and then at his lips. Was it bad that I really liked kissing him? I leaned towards him and then pulled back quickly. "I don't think he'd appreciate a wolf lick." He looked through his list of guests and talked to me about them, telling me a little bit more about each one. I laid down, facing him, and listened, with my head up and my ears forward. I liked hearing him talk, too. Then a smell drifted towards me, and I lifted my nose in the air and inhaled. Jonathan stopped and watched me. I turned and looked towards the small kitchen, and he chuckled as my stomach rumbled. When he stood, I jumped off the couch and gave myself a hard shake, the chain around my neck rattling a little. We headed towards the kitchen, and the cook turned and smiled at us. Jonathan stepped in and looked down at the steak she was pulling out of the refrigerator. She washed it off and put it on a large plate. When she offered it to Jonathan, he frowned and looked at me. He wasn't sure how I would like him feeding me. I gave a small bark. Just give me the food, I thought, laughing. He took the plate and then knelt down and set it on the floor. Okay, him putting the plate down was one thing, but having him sit there and watch me devour it was another. He smiled and stood. I'll give your dad a call and see what's going on, he said, and left. I had inhaled part of the steak before he finished his sentence. The cook was nice enough to turn and start doing other things as well. Wolves aren't known for their table manners, and the steak quickly ended up on the floor. I didn't care. When it was gone, a large bowl of water was set down, and I leaned over it. As I drank, the charm on my necklace fell into the water, and I heard a small buzzing from it. A second later, I heard footsteps running in. I looked up, water dripping from my chin, to see Michael standing there frowning. What? I huffed, and saw Jonathan appear behind him. Then I heard the doctor's voice. There wasn't room for him in here. Michael knelt and lifted his own chin. Oh. I lifted mine, and he reached down and took hold of the charm. It's warm, he stated. I'm going to take it off her in case it's shorting out. He reached around and undid the heavy-duty clasp that was meant to survive this form. When he stood up with it in his hand, I shook hard again. What good is it if it can't handle her getting a simple drink of water? I heard Michael hiss, apparently at the doctor, since the man started to fuss back. They walked off, and I looked up at Jonathan. Sorry, I can't really move it out of the way, I thought. He smiled at me. What if you were out in the rain, or went swimming, but you had it on in the hot tub? He turned his head and hollered the information behind him. He was right. I did have it on then. I looked down at the bowl of water. Then I leaned forward and sniffed it. It smelt just like regular water. Jonathan bent down and took the bowl. Let's have this checked out, just in case. But I'm still thirsty, I whined, and followed him and the bowl out. He walked it over to the doctor and pushed it out to him. I want this checked as well, he stated with authority. I saw the doctor's lip twitch, but he took the bowl. What's his problem? I thought, and Jonathan smiled down at me and winked. Ah, seems the fact that Jonathan and I were a couple now, even if unofficially, meant that he had certain rights. Like I said, becoming an official couple gave two certain privileges. In this case, it must mean that the doctor had to follow Jonathan's order when it came to me. Then again, my dad had said Jonathan was in charge of me when he wasn't around. Either way, I liked that, and my tail wagged to show it. The doctor set the bowl down and then took a dropper and put it in the water. Then he moved the dropper to his table and did some things I couldn't see from my spot on the floor. When he pushed it under his fancy microscope, there was a beeping from another part of the room. I turned, and the door opened. I let out a loud bark and trotted over to my dad as he and his guards walked in. He smiled and knelt. Well, it looks like we caught that mysterious note writer, he smiled at me. My brows went up, and Jonathan walked over. My dad looked at him. All of the prints on the paper checked out except one. So we printed all the help here in the manor. We got a match with one of the maintenance people. Why would they want to talk to me? I thought, looking to Jonathan, who asked the same question as if it were his own. Seems he has a cousin on the outside that started a group that wants to protect her, my dad said, standing up. They seem to think that she is being held prisoner here and that we're conducting wild experiments on her against her will. I noticed the smile didn't reach my dad's eyes. They think you'd do that to your own daughter? Jonathan hissed, and I snorted my agreement to his statement. Yes, my dad said flatly, and I growled. The smile did make it to his eyes then, and he winked down at me. I think we were able to explain things to him and show him just how wrong he was. My brows rose again, and my tongue went in my mouth. What does that mean? I thought. Dad looked back to Jonathan. It was important that this type of fear be squashed quickly. The others are bad enough. We don't need groups trying to rescue her on top of it. What others? Jonathan didn't look down at me, so I looked back at my dad. We're going to bring him in here and let him see and talk to Reina. Do you think that's safe? Jonathan asked, and I noticed his jaw was tight. My dad shrugged. It's the fastest and surest way to show this type that we are helping her and keeping her here for her safety. Jonathan frowned but nodded. Michael walked up, looking about as thrilled as Jonathan was. We'll wait until she shifts back, my dad continued. That way she can talk to him. Jonathan and Michael looked even less happy, and I had to agree with them, but I trusted my dad. If talking to this guy would keep me out of this chamber, I was all for it. Can we get out of here then? I asked, looking back at Jonathan. So, is there an all clear? He asked. My dad shook his head. Not yet. I want to wait until she shifts and they talk. I could have bullied him into calling the others and telling them to stand down, but I didn't think that would help the image they have of us right now, he chuckled. I growled a low, deep growl, deciding that I didn't like this maintenance guy already. What kind of person thought a father would do something like that? Vampire or wolf? I asked, and Jonathan looked up and asked my dad. Vampire, he replied, and my lip curled. I could almost understand a wolf that didn't know my dad, but a vampire? He should know better. My claws came out, and I wished I could claw at something, anything. They seemed to itch for it. I smelt Track and turned. He stood there with his hair messed up from sleep. He was wearing a pair of PJ pants and no top. I smiled in my own way, my pack pride kicking in. He was solid, and his chest muscles showed that he was in amazing shape, even for a wolf. Track ran a hand through his hair and then forward again, messing it up even more, which actually looked good on him. He noticed us and walked over, his eyes scanning everyone there. He looked down at me real quick, and I gave a greeting bark. Can you hear me? I thought, and he nodded as he looked at Jonathan. Was that a yes? I asked, tilting my head. Track looked down at me and gave another nod. Okay, just checking. He smiled, and then Jonathan, not my dad, filled him in. He was frowning from the beginning and shook his head by the end of it. He agreed that this vampire needed to be talked to, but he didn't like the idea of me being the one to do it. I sat down and listened to my dad explain why this was going to have to happen this way. I watched Track's triceps flex in response. He was not happy, but he was outranked. So muscle twitching and a little arguing was all he could do. I did notice that he stepped closer to me, though, being protective without thinking about it. He was so awesome. We have to wait until she shifts, my dad finished. I closed my eyes and tried to find the tingle, tried to find the source it came out of so I could shift now and get this over with. I shook as I focused and let out a yelp when Track's leg brushed against my side. I opened my eyes and he knelt. Were you trying to force a shift? He asked, and I barked. You have to relax and think about the change. Picture it in your mind. I forgot that he and most werewolves could shift at will. I sat and looked at him, listening as he explained how he did it. Finally, he nodded, and I closed my eyes again. I thought about my vampire form, my skeleton build, and searched for the trigger he said was something that once I found it, I would always be able to find. I growled as I tried, and he told me I had to relax and take my time. I didn't want to. This was my body, and I wanted it to listen to me. When I opened my eyes, he shook his head at me. You can't force it out of pure hard-headedness, he chuckled. You have to work with it. It's as much a part of you as anything else in there. You just need to search for it, slowly, and relax. He stressed the last part. I snorted and then closed my eyes. I made myself relax and focus on searching internally, listening to my body and trying to find that source that would help me to control my shifts. Why he hadn't told me about this before was on the top of my list of questions to ask later. Your shifts were too erratic, he whispered. You found a way to step out of the pain. You had to be able to do that first. All wolves have to get past that part before this one. Okay, that made more sense. I swayed a little, hearing my heart beating and feeling my skin under my fur. Then I thought about it being covered in vampire skin. I didn't push it. I just let myself remember the feeling of skin versus fur. Just then I felt something pull. Something so deep inside me that I couldn't tell if it was mental or physical. I got so excited that I jumped and opened my eyes, and poof, it was gone. I growled, my ears down. I had it, I barked. Trax smiled. Good, that's great. Good? Great, I snapped. As soon as I felt it, I got excited and I lost it. I was mad at myself. Jonathan was kneeling next to Track now, and Track smiled. Most wolves can't feel it at all for weeks or months. You found it the first time you tried. Oh, okay. That changed things, and I felt proud instead of mad. I closed my eyes and tried to focus, but I was tingling from the excitement. Take a break, Track chuckled. You'll wear yourself out. I opened my eyes. I want to do it. I can do it. Always the overachiever, he laughed, and I nipped at his arm. The doctor came over and said the water was fine. Jonathan stood up. Then why did the charm short out? The man held it out and turned it over. It was cracked, a small crack, and the water got in. Jonathan, the doctor, and Track all looked at me, and I barked, hopping back. What? I didn't do anything to that. Jonathan and Track looked back at the man. Jonathan shook his head. It should be strong enough to handle her shifting, and it does no good if she has to be careful with it. The man shrugged. It was made strong, but I'll need to go back to my lab to work on it more. Track reached over and took the two wolf charms off. My dad walked up and looked at Jonathan. Okay, that was odd. Seeing my dad let Jonathan take lead role when it came to me. The passing of the torch, I thought. It was sad, symbolic, and touching all at the same time. My dad was starting the process of handing his little girl over to another man and putting me in his care. Okay, maybe that seemed a little caveman-like, but it wasn't that bad. It was sweet, and I felt my throat tighten. Then I felt the twinge inside again. This time I tried not to get excited. I closed my eyes and searched for it. It seemed to reach out, and I met it. At the same time, the pain hit. It was very hard to step outside of the pain and keep hold of the focus inside me as well, but I did it. I spent so much time focusing that it seemed like mere seconds before I was opening my vampire eyes. I was there laying on a with a blanket over me. Too bad it wasn't like in the comic books where I kept my clothes on when I shifted. And that's where I'm going to stop.